Good evening, everyone. We are going to get started in a little bit. We're going to give people a little bit more time to come in. We had about 22 people registered for tonight, so maybe wait about 1 to 2 more minutes after 6 and we'll get started. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Najma Mohammed. I'm a planner here at the City of Kansas City, Missouri City Planning and Development Department, Development Management Division. And today I will be co-hosting the conversation on the Infill Residential Development Ordinance that we're proposing before City Plan Commission and City Council. Today we will be using the Zoom webinar function to host this meeting. If you signed up, you are able to signify whether or not you wanted to be a panelist and act as a representative for the neighborhood organizations that we are focusing on today. And so you can at this time raise your hand if that was something you indicated in your registration, and we will start to promote you all accordingly. We ask that you stay muted until we start introductions as to not cause any confusion during that process. Throughout, if you are hearing questions being asked by those who are representing the neighborhood associations and you feel like maybe your questions aren't being addressed or asked, you will have the opportunity to ask questions using the chat function as well as the question and answer function, whichever serves best for you. And we will have those questions throughout. We will also have moments throughout our presentation to take questions for each section of our presentation. So we ask that at that time, you ask questions that are only related to the information that we just discussed. And at the end of the meeting, if you feel like we did not cover something throughout all of the sections, those questions can be raised during the question and answer portion. Today's neighborhood focus is MANHEIM, IVANHOE, SQUIER Park, VALENTINE, and South HYDE Park. If you are here on behalf of a different neighborhood, or you have already attended a neighborhood meeting and been able to speak on behalf of your organization, we ask that you leave room and open up space for those of us who this is their first time interacting with us and their first time being able to ask us questions one-on-one. So if you are here representing other neighborhoods, that's awesome. You can still get the information. We just ask that the focus of the questions and in terms of specificity to the ordinance, focus on the neighborhoods that I have here on the screen. And for those panelists who are joining in representation of these neighborhoods, if you want to rename yourself on Zoom so we have that understanding of which neighborhood you are speaking for or representing, that would be helpful for us as well. So first, we're going to open up a question for everyone to get a feel for how much you all know about infill residential development already prior to the passage of this ordinance, or even having read this ordinance. What is your comfort level with it? So if you all don't mind answering this question in the poll that's being posted, go ahead and start putting your answers in, and we'll get a feel for where people are. Okay, so we don't have anyone that knows nothing at all, so that's a good sign. I'm hoping that we leave here today with everybody knowing enough to be dangerous and a little bit more than where they started and a little bit more than only having read the ordinance. So we're working with something here. It's good. It's a good question. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'll again introduce myself. My name is Najma Mohammed. I'm a planner with City Planning and Development. And if my colleagues would like to introduce themselves, then we'll go ahead and allow for all of our panelists to introduce themselves as well.
I'll start. I'm Joe Rexwinkle with City Planning and Development.
Anna Naniski, City Planning and Development.
Barnes, City Planning and Development.
You might want to lead the rest of them through, Najma.
Yeah. We'll start with Chris.
Chris Koch, South HYDE Park.
Taj or Tej.
I'm Tej Candola, SQUIER Park.
Tiffany.
I'm Tiffany Moore with the Kansas City Neighborhood Advisory Council.
Okay. If there's anyone who are currently they're currently in the audience as attendees and would like to be promoted as panelists to represent MANHEIM or IVANHOE or any of the other organizations, you all are welcome to do this at this time. Please raise your hand and you'll be promoted as panelists.
No one else is raising their hand, Nashma. I think you can continue.
Okay. So today we're going to go over again the basis of the Infill Development Ordinance, what changes will be happening, what's going to happen next, and open it up for questions. Again, like I said, there is room for questions at the end of each section. So we ask that the questions at the end of each section focus on what the section discussed. And then at the end, we'll have the opportunity to discuss everything in its entirety and fill in any gaps we may have missed throughout in terms of your questions. So the purpose of this ordinance is a proposal of 2 amendments to the Chapter 88 Zoning and Development Code. One is to the minor subdivisions regulations, and the other is to the Lawton building standards. If approved, this would support provisions for housing and reinvestment in existing housing stock throughout the city. And the goal of these changes is to create and allow for contextually appropriate residential development on pre-existing lots. So what is development? Development is any kind of building, construction, renovation, or maintenance of a property. So this is any land or parcel being maintained and or any structure on a parcel of land that's being maintained or built in any form or fashion. Who are developers? Developers are any individual, corporation, partnership, or entity that's maintaining and investing in a property. This can be you as a homeowner, it can be you as a renter maintaining a property. This can also be larger organizations maintaining multiple properties, or even one single property owner maintaining multiple properties across the city. So I want us to realize that developers don't mean just mean these big commercial companies that owns a lot of land. This can be someone like yourself or your neighbor who just happens to own more than one property, or just owns their property. They're a developer. If you're working on your home, you're expanding your home, improving your home, you're in fact a developer if you're improving the land that you own, or even if you're improving the land that you don't own but you maintain or abide in. So what is infill development? On a surface level, it is development on any undeveloped lot that's surrounded by developed lots or pre-existing structures, or it's a lot with pre-existing infrastructure that has yet to be developed on. This can also mean the improvement of an existing developed lot or an existing structure on an infill lot. And I'll get into how we're wanting to define it through our ordinance a little bit later here in the presentation. And so what this picture is showing, and we'll get into it a little bit more throughout the presentation, is the possibility of what our ordinance is proposing. Essentially, the larger box here in green is showing what is currently allowed based on our conventional zoning and development codes lot and building standard for residential development. And the smaller portion is what the infill development ordinance would require and encourage in terms of building contextually to the homes that are surrounding it on the same block face. And so what we're proposing isn't anything that people cannot already do. These are already processes that are put in place that are available to the public. However, it just takes a little bit longer to get to the point of being able to go to permits and maintain their property, or getting to the point to go to permits and simply build on their lot that is perfectly buildable. And so essentially what happens is sometimes a lot does not meet zoning code requirements and it is thus deemed non-conforming. And so someone will have to survey the property and go through a pre-application meeting with city staff to determine what they need to do in order to bring their property into conformance. And so that can happen in one or two ways, or both and a minor subdivision process, which we'll explain in greater detail in a few slides here, or they can apply for a variance to the code through the Board of Zoning Adjustments. The Board of Zoning Adjustments have the final determination on a variance, and they, if approved, they can build anything, a developer can build anything that confines to what the variance was requested for. If denied, you cannot build at all. There's a lot of variances we see come in are variances to single family homes that already exist, but for some reason, whether it be zoning changes or simply the age of the structure, it is not in conformance. It sits within what we consider our front setbacks or our side yard setbacks because of the shape and size of the home when the home was built. It doesn't meet our current lot and building standards. And so the proposed process would allow for a more straightforward process to go to permit. It will allow for us to create a new set of lot and building standards called Infill Lot and Building Standards that would take the context of the homes on the same block face and use those to determine what the lot and building standards are for an infill lot. And that can also be a lot with the property that's already on it. So if the average of the setbacks or lot and building standards allows for your home to sit where it currently is, essentially you will not have to go through a variance process under infill lot and building standards versus having to go through a conventional process under our current lot and building standards for conventional residential development. And so when we're talking about development, there's two types of development. There's by right development and there's the entitlement process. By right is when you can build within what the code allows for and you don't need any permissions, so to speak, from our zoning and development entitlement processes. This means you don't have to go before City Plan Commission, City Council, or the Board of Zoning Adjustments. You're able to fit within what the code allows for, and you can go ahead and build after going to permits and acquiring the proper materials for building codes and all of that. An entitlement process, on the other hand, is when you must receive permission to build, and these can be larger projects or unique projects that are slightly different from what our code allows, or projects outside of what the zoning and development code and the lot and building standards allow for altogether, and you have to alter the space or the policies that govern that space in order to fit the goals that you're trying to reach. Sometimes these are outside of what's currently there, but a lot of times what we see for Board of Zoning Adjustments is simply allowing for what already exists. So this process is trying to bring things into compliance that shouldn't be non-compliant to begin with. And you'll hear us say a lot non-conforming versus conforming lots. A conforming lot is a lot that meets all the building standards. So all the lot and building standards that I just discussed, these are setbacks or how far your home has to sit from the property line. That's your front property line, your side property line, and your rear property line. These, this is the lot width, how wide your property has to be, lot depth, how deep your property has to be. Your lot width and your lot depth controls your setbacks. So those two things are, the setbacks are based on lot width and lot depth. For your side yards is lot width, and for the rear and front yard, it's the lot depth, with the exception of a street side yard. And then there's lot area and height, and there's a whole lot of things that goes into how a structure can be built on a parcel of land. And a conforming lot means that someone is able to do that. Someone is able to meet all of those requirements without varying at all. A non-conforming lot, however, does not fall into what our conventional standards allow for and require. And so that means they have to get a variance of some type in order to build on the lot and to build per our zoning requirements based on their the lot and building standards. So all of these lots you see here, or all of these homes you see here, would be considered non-conforming. Obviously, it doesn't mean that these lots are not buildable. They can be built upon, but because of the zoning, the current zoning, and when these houses were built and how these houses were built, they sit outside of what the law allows for today. And so any improvement or expansion on this home will likely require these homeowners to go through a Board of Zoning Adjustment process in order to maintain their property. And so we want to be clear on what this Infill residential ordinance is not, and so that we can focus on what it really is and what we are trying to put forth with these text amendments. This is not forcing people out of their homes. If you happen to have a home on a non-conforming lot, it doesn't change anything for you other than possibly making that lot legal and no longer non-conforming. It allows for you to do things on your property that now would require a Board of Zoning adjustment process that, had it been a few years ago or had the zoning been different, you wouldn't have to go through. And sometimes it is simply making your home contextual to all the other homes around you, but for whatever reason, that isn't the case. And this does not allow for development people cannot already do. We're not adding new types of housing types. We aren't telling developers that they can come into the city and build wherever and however they want to. Anything a developer can do right now, they can still do under this ordinance. This does not directly sell property to out-of-state developers. I want to make it very clear that city staff do not communicate housing or do not communicate lots for sale or anything like that to developers. That's illegal. We cannot do that. We do not do that. That is not our job. This does not control the architectural design elements of a property. We cannot control what type of building materials go on a house at this time. This is not a design standards ordinance, and it's not making any amendments to allow for or prohibit any kind of architectural design structure in terms of how the house looks, only how the house is built within the setback, height, and building regulations. This does not regulate green space. While this is something we all care about very much, this is not a part of this ordinance at this time. This does not change for or allow differently than what is already allowed for zero lot line housing or no setback requirements on either side of a home. Zero lot line housing, if it is already allowed in a certain zoning district, it still is. This ordinance does not change that. And lastly, this does not adopt affordable housing policies or help the passage of the affordable housing ordinance. While this may assist in that by allowing for greater development to happen and possibly more spaces with pre-existing infrastructure, city planning and development management division staff do not have the power to pass that ordinance through, and we do not have the final say or decision making on that. Do we have any questions at this time?
This is Tiffany with KCNAC. One of the things that I had mentioned last week that I want to ask to be included in tonight's discussion is how they shift away from the entitlements process. Sometimes that's variances, BZA, that kind of thing, is where the neighborhood connection is lost, right? So there are a lot of different conversations, a lot of different neighborhood types, but anytime we move away from the entitlement process, those triggers to engage with neighborhoods are they don't take place, right? Those triggers are not taking place.
Sure. So as I was saying before, this isn't allowing for people to do anything that they cannot already do. And in terms of non-conforming lots, if their lots were not made non-conforming due to rezoning or the implementation of zoning in and of itself, these are things people would be able to do on their properties already. These are things that people with conforming lots can do on their property. And so what this ordinance is allowing for, if anything, is for these lots to be able to fit into the context of the neighborhood that they're already in. It is taking from what homes are already on their block to allow for them to build within that context. It's not bringing in a different context from a different neighborhood. It's all what's already there. And I think that oftentimes the Board of Zoning Adjustments is used to legalize things that should not be illegal, that if it were illegal, it would quite literally require people to tear down their houses. So that's allowing for people to work on their front porch, but they can't do so because it's already sitting in the front yard setback. And any new building or any tear downs and rebuilds of, even if it's the same exact footprint in some cases, in our permits department requires them to come into compliance with today's zoning and development code. And in order to do that, they have to go before the Board of Zoning Adjustment. However, that's only because the house already sits into that setback. That wouldn't necessarily need a public engagement process because the house already exists. It wouldn't be changing the character of the home or anything like that. In terms of going outside of what is currently allowed, that's still going to be a process. If someone does not want to conform with what the infill development standards require, they're still going to have to go before the Board of Zoning Adjustment, or they're still going to have to go before City Plan Commission and City Council.
So one of the other comments that I had previously made was relative to unpermitted construction. So just to be clear, there are lots of examples of properties that were originally constructed in older parts of the neighborhood or older parts of the city that don't comply with the modern zoning that was laid over the city in recent decades, right? But there are also unpermitted construction activities that happen all the time. And so as someone who is really familiar with that, there is a concern that we will be legitimizing the process of asking for forgiveness as opposed to permission, right? So if I build a huge front porch on my house without a building permit and I don't get caught, this infill language would then legitimize that because it's existing construction and it would become a part of this averaging what's taking place within 100 feet of each house. And so, as I've shared a couple of different times, KCNAC is looking at the unintended consequences to make sure that the efforts that we need to make to support the infill development in parts of the city that have been historically under-resourced and constrained don't create an entirely new set of challenges in other parts of the city. Because every single existing neighborhood would be subject to all of these. We're one tornado and one big fire away from any neighborhood in the existing city being an opportunity for infill development. And so we can't assume that neighborhoods that don't have empty lots right now shouldn't be evaluated in terms of unintended consequences.
Okay. I'd also say that some of those things that you mentioned, regardless of this ordinance passing or not, people can already do, and people already do, as you've said. So I don't think that this ordinance would change or encourage illegal building. If anything, it would help people shy away from building illegally because it will allow them to do so. And instead of spending money toward a Board of Zoning Adjustments process that, again, they are now having to do because of some other disadvantage outside of their control, they can put money toward permits. And so that's kind of a question or a hypothetical that we could go kind of in a spiral of how these unintended consequences or where money goes and how areas that have been not invested in previously may be impacted or may not be impacted. If anything, the areas of the city, and I believe Joe showed that in last week's conversation, some of the most impacted areas of the city in terms of non-conforming lots are those that have been historically disinvested in. And so this would allow for them to maintain their properties in ways that maybe they weren't able to before because they did not have the money and or the time to go through entitlement processes that someone in a different area of the city may have both of money and time in a conforming lot. And so again, that's kind of a hypothetical, but that's okay. We'll get into the ordinance a little bit more and try to see where that could apply and where that is relevant. Do we have any other questions? I see Donna, you have your hand up. I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. You weren't able to introduce yourself before.
Donna Bowling, I'm a representative from South Hyde Park. I have two questions right now, and I have some others later on. The infill definition is any parcel or any lots set out prior to January 1st, 1954. What were the boundaries of the city in 1954?
We can answer that question if you don't mind a little bit later in the presentation. We have a parcel map with some of that information on it.
Okay, and do you have the volume of requests that have been going to the BZA? Because I'm having a little difficulty understanding the magnitude of the issue that this is supposed to address. I understand there's a large number of properties that are non-conforming, but how many are actually going to the BZA? And then, that's why I'm not quite understanding the magnitude of the problem. Then I'll have some other questions I understand later on in the details.
Okay.
Thank you.
So in terms of the volume, you're welcome. Twofold. One will be going into greater detail in terms of what we were able to gather from our annual BZA report and our City Plan Commission presentation. So if you would like to join us for that on May 17th, that meeting starts at 9 a.m. We will be at the towards the end of the docket, but I can't guarantee what time that'll be. You can join us there and we'll go into greater detail into the volume of BZA cases we get, the type, where they're coming from, that sort of information. I think it also speaks to the volume can speak in both ways toward why we aren't seeing a certain number of cases versus the kind of cases we are seeing and where those are happening in the city and who has the capacity and the resources to go through the Board of Zoning Adjustments process. But that's definitely something we'll go into greater detail in our City Plan Commission presentation. Unfortunately, I don't have that with me right now, mostly because I want to keep it consistent in terms of how I've been leading the neighborhood meetings. I don't want to give you all new information that the other meetings we've had did not have access to. So that'll happen at CPC.
Nashma, let's take 2 more questions and then move on to the rest of the presentation because a lot of these things are going to be covered in the next section.
Chris?
I can hold my questions for later in case they're addressed in the presentation.
Yeah, that's fine. I can as well.
Okay. So we'll go ahead and move on.
Okay, so the next section is the minor subdivision ordinance versus the infill residential development lot and building standards. So this next slide, please. So first off, let's talk about what is a subdivision. It's really how lots are made. Currently, there's 2 procedural paths on how we create lots in Kansas City. The first one is major subdivisions. So think of like a new neighborhood going up way up on the fringes of the town with 30, 40, 50 lots where we're creating new streets, adding public improvements. That's a major subdivision. Tonight we're going to be focusing on minor subdivisions, which are administratively approved, such as a lot split, lot line adjustment, consolidation. We'll get to that here in a second. So what is the current problem? The zoning and development code is kind of clear in a couple ways on when it comes to minor subdivisions. The first issue that it conflates eligibility criteria with approval criteria. The second, that it assumes that every subdivider is dividing land into new lots for the purposes of development. And the third is that any subdivision involving 6 or more lots has to be approved through the major subdivision process. So what are the solutions? Next slide, please. The solutions that we're proposing are the city approval by right when consolidating lots or when reestablishing lots. The second is to organize subdivision types by a new naming convention and clarifying each eligibility versus approval criteria, which we'll go into in a second. And then providing incentives for incremental developers and minor subdivision policies that complement the infill development. So here are the 4 types of minor subdivisions that we're proposing. Type 3 is the new type that we're proposing, but we'll go through each one. So type 1 is no net increase in lots. So for example, if you have 2 lots and you consolidate them into 1 lot, you don't increase. And for a lot line adjustment, if you take 2 lots and move the lot line back or forth, and you still have 2 lots in the end, that's a lot line adjustment. This type 2 that we're proposing, the name that we're proposing, is a net increase up to 5 lots. They can already do this today. If you take a large piece of land, divide it up 5 different ways, that's your lot split. Type 3 is the new type, which is a net increase up to 20 lots. It's same as type 2, except this one is for 6 or more lots to 20, and this may include some public improvements. Type 4 is a condominium plat, which is, think of a high-rise downtown where each level somebody else owns. It's really just platting a piece of land in a three-dimensional space. So, the proposed minor subdivision ordinance allows for the reestablishing of the original plotted lot without going through the minor subdivision process. As you can see, the picture on the right has two pink lines going through it. Those are the, and that's so two pink lines going through it right there. Those are the original plotted lot lines. So at one point in our history as a city, council approved those lot lines, and over time, you can see the picture on the left is what the lot looks like today. It is a combination of the three lots. And so at one point in our history, they have consolidated all those lots. This ordinance would allow for the reestablishing of those lot lines by right. It is important to note that this does not always mean that these lots would be buildable. There's an example down south of several of a neighborhood that consists of small 20-foot, 25-foot wide lots. And this ordinance would not just automatically make those buildable. It would be in conjunction with the lot and building standards that the infill ordinance would create. So if the infill ordinance would not allow for that, and the zoning currently does not allow for the building of those lots, it would not be beneficial for a developer to buy these lots like that. But in this example we see on the screen, they potentially could have two more homes on those lots. I guess we'll go for a round of questions.
Gentlemen, did you have questions specifically about the minor subdivision portion of the proposed ordinance?
Okay, we'll go ahead and.
I do. I thought someone else had their hand up, so I was just waiting. Matt, could you go back to the slide with the shapes in it? I want to ask a question about the first type so I understand what that slide shows. The type 1, what are those two diagrams showing? It says no net increase in lots. Is that, what is, relate the blue shapes and the green shape to me in that equation?
Yeah, so the top diagram is you're taking two lots, the blue lot and the yellow lot, and you just you're creating one larger lot.
So that's a decrease in lots then. Okay.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
And so the second one is you're taking the blue lot and the yellow lot, and you move the lot line over a little bit so that the yellow lot absorbs some of the blue lot. And so you still have two lots in the end. There's no net increase in lot. It's just a lot line adjustment. So if you,
okay.
You and your neighbor want to move your lot line back and forth 5 feet, and both of those are things that already do exist, and we do here.
Sure. Okay, that's helpful. And then on type 3, is that diagram indicating that all of the colored lots in the lower portion become the green block?
Yeah, so that's
existing.
Yeah, so that is the green block is existing, and this is, we'd be able to subdivide. I think, yeah, here's 8 lots that are being created for that, but up to 20. So you're taking a large lot and dividing it.
Okay.
I guess I had one question, where is the, if you look at the original plot lines, and those lines are now 3 properties, say instead of them all 3 being, or 2 of them being empty, if you had a house on, say, the left one and on the right one, and the middle one was owned by one person, can you reestablish the lot as the left 2? Can you, or is it only if I were to purchase the third one that you could actually go to the original lot? Does it make sense?
So you're asking if they're all under separate ownership, can you reestablish the originally platted lot lines?
Or if 2 out of 3 are under the same ownership. If I owned on the right side, if I owned the left the leftmost two of them and had a house on one of them, could I?
You
Yes.
could, as long as
Yeah.
they're not changing where that lot line is. So if you're wanting to shift it at all, that would create another type of minor subdivision,
But-
a type one potentially.
Like 2 of 3 would be fine.
I'm sorry, I missed that. You went out for a second.
I was saying combining 2 of 3 of those would be fine.
Correct. Donna, do you have a question about minor sub?
Are you ready for me? I'm sorry.
Yes, you can go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. I had a question. When they, like on the other line, again, where they took went to the 12, went from the like 4 lots or to 20 lots, do they have to meet the minimum lot size in that zoning that's in it? So like you're splitting it up into 6 to 20 lots. Do those 6 to 20 lots need to meet the zoning requirements for the zoning area, or is there a new difference that they have to do for the infill zoning lot size?
No, it'd be based off the current zoning that's there.
So the lot size would be based on the current zone, not the infill zoning, but the current zoning, like R 2.5 or something like that. Okay.
All right. So,
Thank
yeah. So if we're separating the lot and building standards at this time to just focus on our minor subdivision portion, minor subdivision amendments, yes, that would mean they're subdividing in accordance with the current zoning. And if not, that would still require a public hearing before City Plan Commission and City Council.
One question relating to the same one I had prior. If the two, we have in Squire Park a couple of lots that have been previously shown as to be multifamily. If one of those lots was multifamily and the other one was single family, is there a preference on if you were to combine the 2 lots? Does one of them supersede the other and the zoning?
The zoning, so the zoning would stay this. Are you saying combined 2 lots with that already have a structure on it?
Correct. So like if you okay, so if you label those A, B, and C from left to right,
Mhm.
if you were to say, if there was a multifamily house in B and A was empty, and you combined A and B, would that entire AB square then also be multifamily?
So yes, but I believe there may be some confusion. It is still based on if that housing type is allowed in a zoning district. So if the multifamily unit is already allowed for, then it's still going to be multi-unit. The lot becoming wider does not take away the conforming status if it's legal non-conforming, or the allowance of the housing type if it's not currently allowed.
So Tej, this is Tiffany. Let me ask a question, see if I'm following you. Are the 2 lots that you're describing under 2 different zoning categories? So for example, has the multifamily lot been rezoned through an entitlement process previously?
Correct.
So if 2 lots that are zoned differently are, if you want to combine them, this would be a question for Najma and Joe, though, or maybe Matt, that would have to go through the entitlement, the BZA process, right? Because one of them would have to be rezoned.
Potentially, sometimes in those cases, it's the most restrictive of zoning. Other times it's not building a restricted use or prohibited use on the portion of the lot that is zoned, say R6 versus R1.5.
Let's take one more question specifically about the minor subdivision portion of this proposal. Chris just raised his hand, and then we'll move on, because I do think we're mixing a little bit of the thoughts between the category changes about the minor subdivisions and the further proposals about the infill development. So we want to make sure we get to that and have plenty of time for those questions. Chris?
My question related to this conversation was, does this process change how we go about rezoning? Like, does the rezoning process stay the same regardless of this text amendment?
Correct. That does not change.
Thank you.
For clarity, just one more time, all of these with the exception of type 3 already exist, where essentially for all of the other types, creating a naming convention for them, type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4, that are all cohesive. What we're amending in large part in terms of policy is type 3 in the number of net increase lots that one can create through the minor subdivision process and what is required of them when they do so. So 6 to 20 lots can now be created under a minor subdivision. However, they're required to provide public improvements, and any deviation from that would require for them to go before City Plan Commission and City Council. Okay. So now we're going to get into the infill lot and building standards that we are proposing. One of the issues we are finding is that approximately 23,000 plus lots, residential lots in our cities is considered non-conforming. These are both vacant and occupied lots in residential zone districts residentially used. And most can be defined under our definition of an infill residential development lot or an infill lot. The increase in variance requests for homes that have been made illegal, again, as I was stating previously, by the introduction of zoning, rezoning in terms of downzoning an area to avoid the influence or the input of higher unit homes in terms of apartments in an area where the neighborhood desires a consistent single family home or a single family development, can create areas of the city with non-conforming lots where once it was a R1.5, it's now an R6, creating different lot and building standards on lots that already have pre-existing homes on them. And a lot of the zoning requests or variance requests to the zoning and development code that we see, again, this will be given in clear factual numbers from this year's past annual report, are to the principal structure on a property that already exists and is simply illegal because it is pre-existing and built within the setback requirements under today's conventional lot and building standards. And we also see, by looking at the data under a quick analysis, that a lot of these are spread across parts of the city that we have a general understanding has been historically divested or disinvested, does not receive the same level of resources or attention through market and development as other more wealthier parts of the city. And so a part of that assumption is that people who are living in these areas where their homes are, the state of their home being non-conforming would require for them to go through a board of zoning adjustment process or any entitlement process where the result of getting the variances from the code that they need aren't guaranteed. They are less likely to follow through if they speak with us and or start the process of the entitlement process altogether because of the lack of surety in receiving it after having spent time and money on it. And so what is currently available is our conventional open space and conservation lot and building development standards. The most common is, of course, conventional. We usually see open space and conservation developments in newer builds or major subdivisions like Matt spoke about earlier. And what we're proposing in this infill development ordinance is, or what we're proposing with this infill residential development ordinance is infill development lot and building standards to allow for contextual lot and building standards to what is currently there, what homes on that block face currently have in place in terms of setbacks, in terms of where the home sits on the lot. So that's how close is it to the front, the rear, and sides of the property. This also includes lots, again, as I said before, that have pre-existing structures on them and are considered infill or non-conforming. It will take the average in so many or so few words, the average of the properties on that block face to determine the lot and building standards. And in so doing, likely bring most of those 23,000 non-conforming lots into compliance. And so for a brief moment, we're going to look at the city parcel map. I believe there were questions about this earlier. If someone wants to remind me what layer, yes, the annexation layer. Okay, so this is a lot, this is a map rather available on our website. It's essentially a parcel viewer with the purpose of highlighting the infill development ordinance. And so on this map, we have several layers, including the non-conforming parcels, and I'll go into greater detail about those layers. And the question that was asked was about, I'm missing it. Okay, we're gonna have to improvise. Someone asked a question about annexation.
Yeah, I don't think it's on that map. I think you have to go to parcel viewer.
Okay, that's fine. So on our parcel viewer, we have an annexation layer. Am I in the right space, Matt? Yes. And so I'll briefly show you this because out of context, it's not going to be very clear, but this is how you can figure out where or when different parts of the city were annexed. And I'll explain why that's relevant in the definition. And that's going to be in a few slides here. And so that's how you figure out the answer to that question, Ms. Bowley. And then this map, if you're interested in looking at different parts of the city, you can type your address here and it'll direct you to a parcel. And so say I typed in this address, you'd be able to see if this property was non-conforming and where it's located in reference to other non-conforming properties, if it's vacant or not, which is what the orange represents, and the purple represents legal non-conforming properties. So as you can see, there's several legal non-conforming properties. I'm going to go back to the presentation to show you all a little bit more detail what I'm talking about. So the solution we see to the issue of having an overwhelming number of legal non-conforming properties and understanding the barriers that having to go through entitlement processes that you would not otherwise have to go through if your lot was conforming and if your lot has been made conforming without your input or without it, essentially without it being your fault. If your lot is non-conforming and you had nothing to do with bringing it out of conformance, you should not have to go through such barriers in order to simply build on your lot or improve on your home. That in fact is unjust, and we're trying to fix that. And so by doing that, we're trying to create lot and building standards that meet those needs. And so not only is it meeting the needs of if you're wanting to reestablish previously platted lot lines, it's allowing you to, it's allowing you to build in a way that's contextual to the homes around you. It's allowing for you to maintain the home you already have in a way that's contextual to the homes that are already there, or your home that has been there for years. And it's allowing us to legalize and make buildable lots that otherwise would be buildable, but just aren't under conventional zoning standards that have been blanketed across the whole city. That does not really take into account the character and context and building types of different neighborhoods over time. This slide is to, again, reinforce, we aren't changing the housing types that are allowed in a neighborhood. If the zoning currently does not allow for a apartment or a townhome, this ordinance isn't changing that. It's still requiring all of the same housing types. It's just changing the lot and building standards to become more contextually appropriate with the other residential buildings on that block face and what's currently there. And so to bring it all full circle from the map we are just looking at and some of the questions from earlier, these are the two definitions we're proposing for residential infill. The first one is any residential development, whether existing, new construction, or modification to an existing residential structure on an infill residential lot. The second is a infill residential lot. What is that? It's any lot zoned residentially and meeting one or more of the following criteria. So it's either one or the other, or both potentially. So it's described by deed or plat, recorded prior to January 1st, 1954, or annexed into the corporate limits of Kansas City prior to January 1st, 1954. So even if you weren't annexed until after this, your land will likely have been described by deed or plat prior to January 1954, regardless of the jurisdiction you were in prior to annexation, thus making you an infill lot under our proposed definition. And so this is an area this in the city that is non-conforming. This is a zoomed in portion of the infill development lot that, or not infill development lot, of the non-conforming parcels map rather, where these potentially infill development lots exist. And so what we're looking at is two things. The red outline, the section of our code stated here, 88-610-03-C, makes any lots, non-conforming lots that are abutting and under common ownership, it deems them to be combined. And so part of what this infill development ordinance may do is make these conforming and thus legally formed lots and take them from being combined into being separate lots once again. The purple you see here represents nonconformity, and the pinkish color represents nonconforming lots that are both nonconforming and vacant. The orange is it's just vacant and residential. It does not currently fall out of conformance with the respective zoning in that area. These are just some examples of areas from our map that are represented from the public tonight. So this is an area in South Hyde Park, in MANHEIM, in IVANHOE, SQUIER Park, and in VALENTINE. And so these are examples of what the ordinance discourages. Again, we're not allowing for anything people cannot already do. If anything, we are attempting to restrict some of the development that people currently do out of context. So what we're looking at is someone who took 3 lots on this block and combined them by right. They're able to do so without public engagement or public input. Currently, they did that, combined them and made them into 1 lot and built a huge house that is out of context with the size and placement of the other homes on the block. And so this is what this neighborhood currently looks like. And this is what this neighborhood is becoming without having those contextual lot and building standards. And so this is what we're trying to discourage from happening, is having one huge house in the midst of several homes that are clearly in a certain context outside of what's being proposed here. And what it is encouraging more so is to build homes that are similar in terms of build. Again, we cannot control architectural design, but in terms of build, size, how it's situated on the lot in terms of setback to those that are surrounding them. Some other points of concern that came up are listed here in terms of if you're able to have driveways or garages based on other homes on the block, and all of that has been taken into context from concerns raised by different neighborhood groups, rightfully so, to continue with that idea of having contextually built infill. If there are not currently detached or attached garages on a block face, or not currently driving pads in the front yard, these standards encourage similar builds to occur instead of going outside of that and creating lots that are not contextual or congruent with the homes that are already there. And all of this is a part of the ordinance that again can be found on our Chapter 88 webpage. If you scroll to the bottom and navigate to our Compass KC case number, you will find it there. Do we have any questions?
Donna raised her hand first.
Okay, unmute. So could you go back to that picture that showed the big monster house, but closer to the smaller houses? There. So how does this ordinance keep that from happening?
So what will happen is, I'll go back one more. There we go. So what the ordinance currently proposes is we'll look at this block face and we'll take the setbacks that exist. The lines here are slightly off. This isn't our parcel viewer, but we take the setbacks for this home, this home, this home. If there were the home here, even if not, and then we take measurements, and I don't want to say average too loosely because it's more like 75% of the average and things like that, depending on what the setback is. And we take those averages to make a determination on what can be built here. And so that will restrict what can be built here based on what is already existing. So it won't be too allowed to be much larger or even much smaller than what's currently there. And so combining these three lots will not allow for you to build any bigger. Which is opposite of what the conventional code allows for, because if you have a bigger lot, you have more greater room for setbacks to accommodate setbacks. And so you can build as big as you want to within the envelope of the setback. What this ordinance would require is for the setbacks to match those of the surrounding homes, as well as the building footprint to be similar to that of the surrounding homes.
But isn't there just minimum setbacks and not maximums?
There is a maximum. For instance, our side yard requirement requires the average of what's currently there by a certain percentage, or 10% of the lot width, whichever is greater. So instead of saying a minimum amount, we're requiring the greatest of the amounts to meet what's currently here.
Okay, because I'm not quite reading it that way in the infill development section of the ordinance. You got lots of minimum lots, but I don't see much about maximums, and it's not very clear about that. And that raises another question, but I'll bring that up in another section.
Okay.
Chris, you're next.
And Donna asked my question, but I also am still unsure, or I guess I'm not following how this prevents someone from building a larger house in the context of a smaller house. Say if you've already got a larger lot, does this prevent you from building out of context, not necessarily with a lot merge? Because so far we've talked about lot splits, not lot merging.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I'm not following.
Okay. So I can stop paraphrasing. I'll pull up.
I'm going to raise my hand again because I understand that, and maybe this is the point to talk about it, is about the 100-foot. Is this the point to talk about the 100-foot and the facing of the properties on either side of the project, or is that later on in the discussion?
When you say 100-foot, what do you mean?
The buildings that are within 100 foot, we're doing those as averages for the setbacks and things like that. What my concern is that when we have projects like in South Hyde Park, where we have blocks that have like a couple of triplexes, and then you have a bunch of bungalows, and then you may have another couple of sixplexes. How do you come up with those averages within the 100 feet? And 100 feet is not that much on either side of the building. So how did you arrive at the 100 foot as a limit? Could it be longer?
So it's based off, so I see what you're saying. So the same block face whose lot lines is in whole or in part within 100 feet of the subject property.
Right.
So the block face is really important to look at. We'd be looking at the entirety of that block face to come up with the context of that area. And so it sounds like what you're saying is if there's sixplexes or larger townhomes, in the context of that block would be larger developments. Am I understanding this properly?
Ajma, I think it would be helpful to display the actual standards, because
Yeah, I
I
have
do
it up now.
that that would help facilitate the answers to the questions. I know, Donna, you asked one question about maximums. There is, I guess we'll just start here because Chris asked, I think it was Chris that asked the question about when you merge lots. So the minimum lot area would be 75% of the average of all residentially zoned, legally created lots on the same block face that lie in whole or in part within 100 feet of the subject property. So 100 feet is not a hard and fast. There's not a particular reason, except that some block faces, by the definition that already exists in the code for block face, can be extremely long. There are areas of the city where they're approaching a quarter of a mile, and so when you do that, then you have to calculate a lot of properties, and that can skew it one way or the other. And we're trying to make it a bit easier for people to grasp what that context is. But having said that, there's not, to us, there's not going to be an appreciable difference between 75 or 150 feet. So we're flexible when it comes to potentially changing that number. The minimum lot width is also 75%. There is no, I guess to answer Chris's question, there is no maximum lot area. So that's not because we intentionally excluded it. It is simply because the code doesn't provide a maximum lot area for any district. And so when we're looking at kind of the structure of all of our lot and building standards, we just didn't take that into consideration, but it is something that could be brought into consideration.
I would think that would be good to Joe to do. Because we see such differences in buildings, like in the midtown areas, you have the neighborhoods aren't like the suburbs where every house is exactly the same or setback exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was concerned when I went through this study and didn't see any maximums, and then or any minimum side setbacks, as a percentage, but not as a foot size. So it would seem like it would be helpful to have a minimum foot size and side setback, and not just the percentage.
Okay.
And so that, but it was concerning to me in how you did the averages when we had such a variety of buildings on certain blocks.
Right, but that's also part of the reason why fixed numbers make so many things non-conforming. Because of the wide variety we have. And so it's kind of, either one has its advantages and disadvantages, I guess. Whether you go with percentage based or context based versus a hard and fast number. But some of the other things that kind of would help control for the size and footprint of the building are the floor area ratio maximum. That is not something our other lot and building standards that we currently have. So there's nothing limiting the size of the home currently. That would do that. And we can explain what that means if people would like the explanation. And then there's some other standards about if you scroll up a bit, Najma, about the garages and driveways, which was added. Yeah, it's down, I guess, was added based upon some feedback we received early on in this process back towards the beginning of the year. And that just limits the ability for people to have large garages when they're building a new house on a block that doesn't have any garages, for example, or has very few front-loaded garages and driveways.
This chart answered most of my questions, actually. I probably should have reviewed this earlier.
It's okay. We didn't have it in the presentation.
Sorry. I have one more question. So this is replacing the conventional zoning?
Yeah, if you are on a lot that meets the definitions of an infill development lot, which again is one that was annexed prior to those dates, or platted prior to those dates, then you would follow these standards. You wouldn't get to pick and choose. These would be the ones that would apply, and the only exception to that is what you see in number 4 here, is where if you're on a block, which we have some blocks, of course, in the city where there's no houses at all, they've all been removed. In that case, there's no context to compare yourself to because everything's gone. You can use these standards, or you would have to use conventional standards reduced by 25%. So we could talk about what that would mean if there's questions about it, but so that's the only exception that we could think of was situations where the block's been all the homes have been removed.
Okay, so this is basically the area from the river to about 93rd Street, at least past 75th Street, state line to Independence. Is that basically the area this applies to?
Yeah, there are a few except I would say Blue River is probably a better eastern boundary, but it does cross over the river in a few spots. And then there are a few places up north that were annexed prior to that date, but also some properties north of the river that were platted prior to that date, and then annexed later.
Thank you.
But the widespread, the impact is really, the bulk of the impact is in the area you described, Donna.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Stephanie, did you have a question still?
I do. So in regard to the ordinance that you have on one of these slides relative to automatically combining non-conforming lots that are owned by a single owner, is it that combination? Yeah, exactly. That is in theory, that consolidation is theoretical, right? No one has filed paperwork with the county. It happens sort of in the background, right? So could we not eliminate that issue simply by removing that section or that statement within? Do we have to go this far to address that one challenge that has come up? And then go ahead.
Go on. Okay. I think that's one of many challenges that this ordinance is trying to address. However, correct me on the year, of course, Joe, but that was an attempt made by city staff a few years ago to repeal that section of the code, and it was unsuccessful from vehement opposition.
I think that's wherein lies one of the concerns that KCNAC has heard, that not every neighborhood is comfortable with what's being proposed, that they opposed some of the things that are being rolled into this. And I don't know that making it a larger effort necessarily gets you the support that it needs. The opposition to that might still exist. And so I don't want to lose track of the fact that rolling it into something larger, it maybe is just more challenging for neighborhood folks to follow. I want to make an example of unintended consequences. The language that you had on, I think, the very last slide regarding garage faces on the ground level. So in many of the older neighborhoods, including the Northeast, there are steep lots where the ground level is just the basement garage. And the garage doors, even though it's not like a 3 or 4 garage complex, it's 1 or 2 garage doors, would be more than 40% of the ground level facade. And so that would actually impact building something that is consistent and in context with the neighborhood.
1 second to go there.
So what's the question about the garages?
I'm making just a point here that is an unintended consequence. So that item number 2, if I understood Joe and Najma, is an attempt to avoid large attached garages, which are out of context with the neighborhoods that we're talking about in general. But it has an unintended consequence of not allowing the steep lots whose ground level is the basement garage and has 50 or more % of the ground level facade is the garage. that might still just be a 1 or 2 garage, 1 or 2 car garage, but it would not meet this. So that would actually require something that's currently in context with the neighborhood to now require a variance. And then the last question I'm going to ask, which is a little bit of rhetorical or theoretical, but if we're really trying to strip away the impacts of applying modern zoning language to historical neighborhoods, everything before 1954, couldn't we follow some other cities' approach and just remove zoning altogether? Doesn't it get more and more complicated to continue to modify the modern zoning that we have applied to these old neighborhoods? Or for that matter, couldn't we go back to what has been in place in the past?
I think there's a few issues with going back to what has been in place in the past, because various laws and policies in the past has been detrimental to public health and public safety, which is why we improve upon our policies and modernize our zoning and development approaches, modernize our policies to not disadvantage or
And to be clear, I'm not saying go back into some very, very harmful policies in terms of how the areas were developed, but the physicality of the dimensions and what could be constructed. There are some narrow lot guidelines that have been reinstalled or reinstituted in Kansas City, Kansas, for example. That certainly did not bring back damaging approaches to how it was developed, who could live where. That is absolutely not what I'm talking about. But they've re-established some narrow lot guidelines that are more in keeping with what was built there in the first place. And I'm just curious if there are strategies that have been looked at that other cities have used successfully to address some of these same challenges, because we're not unique in this, right? Every city with an urban core that was established and constructed and platted before 1954 has modern zoning applied to it that creates these issues, right? They don't fit, right? We're trying to put square pegs in round holes.
And let me, sorry, Nashma, but let me respectfully say that I think we should move on from this topic. I think it's a little high level. Zoning in Kansas City is not going to be repealed anytime. All we can do is fix the issues that have been brought up in the past. And this is just one solution that we have created. We have done lots of research in looking at other cities and looking at what could potentially be best for our zoning code and how it functions in between planning and other departments that review permits. And that's just the state of the draft ordinance at this time.
Perfect. We're going to go right into what the Infill Residential Development Ordinance is. I think that was a perfect segue. What we are attempting to propose with these amendments, in large part, helps other departments in the city do make policies and make strides forward other areas of interest, some of which I discussed earlier in terms of accessible and affordable housing options, as housing, we all know, has become quite inaccessible in terms of accessing homes, and single family homes becoming less accessible to greater portions of the population, providing fewer barriers for first time and incremental developers. Again, reminding us that developers aren't just large commercial companies that come in and buy all these properties. Developers are first-time home buyers. Developers is you as a home buyer. Developers is you as a renter maintaining your property or wanting to maintain a property, but maybe you can't currently do so because of the processes and the finances and resources required to go through our entitlement processes if you were to purchase a home on a non-conforming lot, or if you are currently living in a home on a non-conforming lot. Again, we're streamlining processes for homeowners that they would normally be able to do the Board of Zoning adjustments in a lot of ways in the recent history because of rezoning and various other issues with policy has been used in ways that was not originally intended in terms of providing for variances to the zoning and development code. It is not meant to outright allow people to build homes. People should be able to build homes and improve on their homes and maintain their homes by right without having to go before the public to do so, as long as it does not hinder public health in a way that is beyond what our code allows for, or anything like that. It is making use of the land and with the existing infrastructure that's already there. While some parts of the city need infrastructure updates, using the land that's currently been platted and is currently surrounded by other homes and other developments will allow for us to make use of city infrastructure that is already currently existing without expanding it out to new developments. And again, that goes into taking care of what we already have, taking care of the homes we already own, taking care of the property and the land that already exists in the core of Kansas City, Missouri, and outside of the core as well. And this is what Development Management Division can do right now. We have put a lot of effort and research into determining what is best, again, as Anna said, for Kansas City, Missouri. We have looked at other cities' infill development practices. We are constantly training and learning and researching and going based off what we see on a daily basis in terms of case volume, in terms of what we get from neighbors and citizens who call us, in terms of what we see before the Board of Zoning Adjustments as recurring issues that should not be the case if our zoning is allowing for what it should allow for, which is allowing people to build by right on their properties what we feel is useful and appropriate by our zoning and development code per our zoning districts, etc. And so at the end of the day, we're wanting to help other city departments, public works, parks, housing, neighborhood development to make their policies work by giving them a zoning and development code that support it. So we went over the ordinance today. We've answered a lot of questions. We hopefully have given you an understanding of what our limitations are. And again, this is open. We're still in great discussion of what this is about. And we will be going before City Plan Commission on May 17th to present this information, present the findings and feedback we've gotten since we have originally introduced this to the public and how we have made adjustments. We will be presenting that information for the Board of Zoning Adjustment. We will go into greater detail into some of the methods we use to make our calculations on a daily basis outside of this ordinance, again, not allowing for anything we do not currently allow for. So just simply using the tools that we already have at our disposal to better assist and streamline processes for our citizens. So with that, these are some of the rules of engagement since we have a few more panelists than we normally do. We want to encourage everyone, you all have been doing great at this, one speaker at a time. We're wanting to listen to all the questions so we can avoid redundancy and spend more time answering those questions that have not already been addressed. And we wanting to be respectful of other panelists who wish to ask questions. So if you feel like you've taken the floor, taken some of the space, you're wanting to give space to other panelists to ask questions they may have if they have not had the opportunity to do so. So we are at 7:23. How do you want to do this, Anna?
Donna, she raised her hand first. We'll let her speak. Before you get started, Donna, I just want to clarify one thing that you mentioned earlier and to circle back on something that Najma just said. The creation of this ordinance was, yes, inspired by the demand of people seeking variances with non-conforming lots, but also people going through the minor subdivision process, as well as all of the customers who attempt to start a process or get permits with the city and then run into lots and lots of barriers. That last item that I mentioned is harder to quantify, but as we know through our everyday dealings with the city, there are lots and lots of people who run into roadblocks when it comes to improving or developing upon property, small scale and large scale developers alike. So I hope that clarifies your previous question, and take the floor, Donna.
I've got 3 comments. I'll keep it short. Since you're going through the city council on May 17th, is there any way I would like to be able to get the BZA annual report before then?
So it's not city council, for clarification, it's city plan
Oh,
commission.
City Plan Commission, okay. I would still like to have it before then if that's possible. Also, one of the concerns I have is that there's a lack of visibility of when there's an issue, then when an infill requires some changes or to go to the 75% or the 100 deals, that just goes to the director of planning in order to do that, and it doesn't provide any visibility to the neighborhood of what's happening with some of the properties. And the third one is using the term infill causes a struggle with that term, because what it implies when other cities and when other things are going on is it implies that the whole area is available for redevelopment. When in other locations, the use of infill is for vacant lots or underutilized property. And you could say that almost everything that's in this area could be, especially in some of the historic neighborhoods, could be underutilized. So the use of the term infill is difficult to explain to other people, especially when they think that, well, you're saying, okay, this area is already, it's available for infill, so we can destroy the existing housing stock and build something new. So one of the unintended consequences, like was mentioned before, is we don't want to say this encourage people coming in and demolishing a house and putting in another house that's more modern and maybe a little bit bigger. So we've seen that happen in West Plaza. We had a house that recently got demolished that was a fairly good house that's being demolished for another big project. So that's the concerns I have, is that we not incenting people to buy a couple of parcels and destroy existing housing stock, because there's not a look at how demolition occurs in the neighborhoods. So there's several parts with this, is the zoning, the demolition piece that I understand is being worked on some. And then also something else that's coming on that fills into what we're looking at, and the neighborhoods want to look in total, is not only the infill, as we're calling it now, and the new survey that's going about ADU. And so I encourage you that we need to see the total package of what that's looking at that would impact us in the next few years. And thank you.
Donna, out of curiosity, what word does sound more appropriate to you?
I don't know. I really don't know what the word would be, but infill just in other contexts with other cities, it implies that it's a redevelopment area. And I don't think that's what you're intended to do, but I don't know exactly what the word would be. But again, it implies that it's a ripe area for development.
Okay. Is there anyone in the general attendees list that wishes to speak? This is the time to raise your hand and we can promote you, or you can type your question in the chat and I can relay that information to the rest of the panelists. Tiffany, do you have one last question?
Yeah, I was going to add on to what Donna just said in terms of the use of infill. Since I don't think there are any neighborhoods within the 1954 boundary that don't have non-conforming parcels, does it need to be distinguished, or can this be a part of a larger update to our zoning? Does that help remove the point of confusion or lack of clarity?
I guess I'm not understanding your question, that this is adding to existing zoning regulations.
Sure, but as opposed to calling it an infill and differentiating it, is that necessary, since the impacted area within the 1954 boundary is pretty much inclusive of every neighborhood? I don't think there I'd be surprised if there are any neighborhoods within the 1954 boundary that don't have non-conforming parcels.
Yes, from a logistical standpoint, for someone to be able to understand what they're allowed to do, or for someone on a permits or planning team to effectively read the code and identify which regulations to apply to a specific property, it needs to have its own section or have a name or have a process. Lisa?
Yes, I think we need to have another series of meetings because it feels awful rushed. In order to also relay information from all the neighborhoods that all the information you compiled and questions from all the different neighborhoods, so we can get a feel on every neighborhood, not just our own, because some of the questions may be the same, some of the concerns may be the same. And I just feel that the process is rushed. You need more than one meeting for the neighborhoods. My neighborhood wasn't able to attend our meeting because we had another important neighborhood meeting that same night. So we probably had a lack of representation when we had our night. And I think the whole process is very, it's not clear. And as they were saying, some of the terms are not good terms, where there's just a lot of questions and information that still needs to be discussed.
Okay. So when we go before City Plan Commission on May 17th, we won't be asking them to make any motion on what we present to them. We'll be requesting feedback. That'll be another opportunity for the neighborhood to speak and ask questions and get questions answered. The meetings that we did host were based on a series of surveys that went out to those who expressed interest during our town hall, and other sources through calling us and expressing interest, etc., where you all had the opportunity to fill out the survey and give us the best dates that you all could attend. So we didn't schedule anyone on a date that was not specified would be available or accessible to them based on the information we were provided from a representative from that neighborhood. That information can be provided if you want it. In terms of questions on the Chapter 88 webpage, we've posted a frequently asked questions document. This is a compilation of questions that we've received since we originally introduced the ordinance, and questions that we receive every week during our neighborhood meetings, and have been updated with those with the questions. And so after tonight, questions that are yet to be on that document will be updated to that document by next week for people to view. There are, there's a week or so before our next meeting. So if there are still lingering questions in between time, we'll be able to add that to the frequently asked questions list as well. And again, that's made public on the Chapter 88 webpage, as well as the opportunity to receive other answers to questions by City Plan Commission on May 17th.
And I am going to relay a question from my Molly Camp in the attendees list to clarify an item about our entitlement process. Larger developments or developments typically conducted by large builders or large developers are going through an entitlement process, which means there's a development plan or some other sort of review that gets reviewed by the City Planning Commission and the City Council, both which are bodies made up of various residents of Kansas City, Missouri, of various professions, architects, lawyers, real estate agents, community members, to make decisions about properties and the neighborhoods in which those developments are going in. Are we seeing any other questions?
Angie has her hand raised.
I have promoted Angie as a panelist.
Thank you. So hey, I was listening. I didn't quite think that the question as to that monster house that was in that photo How exactly is that prohibited? I mean, there's a lot of talk about setbacks and things, but if I were to buy, like 3 lots and stick them together, I could presumably within the setbacks build something larger than the other houses. And I know the infill has the reference to the height requirements. I mean, is that what you're thinking? Is just that since the bungalows are not as tall, that the height requirement would kick in?
Height as well as floor area ratio. And so that's based on the building coverage and the lot area, but also the numbers of floors within a building. And so if the height of the building is getting taller, and this is my attempt at explaining floor area ratio without a diagram, it's becoming taller, then the structure is not allowed to be as wide or take up as much space on the lot area. With the reverse happening, if it's a wider building, then that takes away from the height that you can build in. And then there's still the height maximum that people are allowed to build to.
Okay, so what's the floor area ratio based on? Is it's not based on lot size?
It is. It's based on lot size. So the floor area ratio in this case, and I'll pull the ordinance back up here. Give me a second.
Yeah,
And
I
I'll explain
have
while she's doing that, what the floor area ratio is the floor area of the home, of any building, in this case a home, divided by the lot area. So if an existing home is 2,000 square feet and the lot area is 10,000 square feet, then the floor area ratio is 0.2. I can't do the math right now, but it's the floor area of the house divided by the lot area. And that includes a second floor. So it's the total volume floor area of the house. And so the floor area ratio being, I think it says 150% of the average. If the average of the homes on that block face are 1,500 square feet, and the average lot is 10,000 square feet, then you can't exceed 150% of the resulting FAR for your own FAR.
Okay.
So it tries to keep this volume. It's a volume measure is what it is. The volume of the building proposed to be within a range of the remaining homes.
Okay, that makes more sense. The setback discussion confused me a little bit because, but if you combine the height with the floor area ratio, that makes more sense to me. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
That's when it gets complicated, when you have the sixplexes next to the bungalows.
Yeah.
When you start calculating the floor area ratio and the 150%, that becomes very complicated. And that would be one thing that where the neighborhoods would really want to know what was going on in those discussions.
Yes.
So
Chris,
can I ask a question about that? Sorry, Najwa, because I think I'm thinking of your neighbor. I mean, South Hyde Park is a perfect example of where there's a lot of mixture of building types within the same block faces. And so is the concern there that because like a 6-unit apartment building is just physically larger in volume than a single family house might be, that you're concerned that the FAR would include the other building types, not just the same building type as what is proposed to be built?
Right. Or you could just put in a much bigger house.
Right. Because you couldn't, if the zoning didn't allow a 6-unit building, which it doesn't in most of that area,
right.
Then you couldn't build that, but you could build a house that was approximately the same size as the 6-unit building. Yeah. Right.
So you could have 6 acres on one side and just some bungalows on the other side, and then it just becomes very complicated.
I'm assuming we're talking about Kenwood specifically.
maybe Joe, the answer is, you know, where it's 150% of the average provided by all residential structures. It's rather like similar residential structures or something like that. So we're comparing homes to homes, apartment buildings to apartment buildings, you know, apples to apples.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's something we can think about. We can look into that.
Najma, while you have that pulled up, can you scroll down to the next page? Lisa has a question about the driveway portion. If you could just go over those standards. I believe there are some concerns about parking, driveways, and then what happens if a property is adjacent to a alley.
Okay. So we'll go through it sentence by sentence. When an improved alley is present, driveways from the street are prohibited. And so from the street would be from the main right-of-way that your house abuts. The driveway would have to come from the alley and access by that improved alley. An improved alley is a city approved right of way that generally has proper pavement, it's not overgrown with trees and things like that. And we have a formal definition of an alley in our code that I can pull up if someone wants to know what it is. When an approved alley is not present, driveways from the street may only be permitted when at least 50% of the homes on the same block face have driveways from the same street. So if there isn't an improved alley to access the homes from the back, you can access the homes from the front using a driveway if 50% of the homes on that block already have driveways. If 50% of the homes do not have driveways, then you would not be allowed to create one under this ordinance. That is something that would require a variance from the code and would require you to go before the Board of Zoning Adjustments to obtain. Does that answer your question, Ms. Guetta?
And Lisa, about who is responsible for improving alleyways, it really just depends on if it is a city alley or if it is abandoned right of way. It's kind of a case by case basis. So I don't know if we can provide too much detail on that. Joe, am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, the developer could improve it if they choose to, but the city could also do it, just like we would our streets. It's the same thing as our streets, either the developer or the city.
Okay, I'm seeing one more person who's in the attendees list raise their hand. They've not gotten a chance to speak, so we'll let her give a question and then we can wrap up our meeting today. I'm promoting Lauren as a panelist. And she has been connected.
Thank you. I just had one question. I'm in South Hyde Park, and so South Hyde Park is predominantly R5 zoning. So taking that as an example, when somebody is trying to develop a lot, are they given the option to use R5 zoning standards or this new infill ordinance, or is it picking and choosing, or does one trump the other?
They would have to follow this ordinance.
Mm-hmm.
Hyde Park is the entire neighborhood was annexed prior to 1954, so
I see.
they would follow this ordinance. Yep.
But would the R5 zoning would it still apply as the most stringent limitations for like maximum development? Like going back to Donna's concern about, if a single family residence was using the infill development standards and was adjacent to a sixplex and a bungalow, it would not be able to exceed some of the maximum limitations of an R5 zoning requirement.
Well, what would happen, and it depends on what you mean by limitation, but the lot and building standards that currently exist for R5 they would continue to exist for R5s that don't meet the definition of infill lot. In the case of your neighborhood, every lot would, because of when it was annexed and when it was platted. So these standards would replace what we call conventional development standards. And the reason for that is because the result of it the result of these standards would be that most of the lots would become conforming.
Got it.
So it would therefore then allow people to, even if you have an existing home and you're wanting to do something to it, you may run into an issue today if your lot's non-conforming, whereas if your lot becomes conforming because of this, you would not run into the same issue.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
So there's a legal and practical challenge with having a non-conforming property that, again, as Najma explained pretty well, it can be overcome through an entitlement process. But in our evaluation and looking at a lot of our neighborhoods where they were either not, most of them became non-conforming as a result of either being downzoned or just that they existed before the city had zoning in the first place. And I think Hyde Park was a neighborhood that was downzoned. It was many years ago, but in a lot of cases, when you look at the history of, at least on our records that we have on it, a lot of times they were downzoned to keep out certain building types like apartment buildings. But the process of downzoning, because the lot area stuff is part of the zoning, is that we made a lot of the lots non-conforming.
Right.
So yeah, so I think that was an unintended consequence, and the result is that even if the use of the lot or the building on the lot is legal and fine, they run into issues because their lot is non-conforming.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, so as Anna said previously, we are unable to take any more questions at this time. So any further questions can be emailed to myself or Anna or Matt or Joe, any of us or all of us together, and we will address them as they come in. Thank you all for attending tonight's meeting. And again, we are going to be going before CPC to give them another presentation of our findings after having had all of our neighborhood meetings that we'd originally planned for on May 17th. And so that'll be another opportunity for you all to come and learn more about how we, the process that went into forming this infill development ordinance and the different processes that we'll use should it pass, should the amendments pass through council. Some of the other information, again, will be explanations of that floor area ratio, as well as the Board of Zoning Adjustments information. Donna, I believe you asked for that review, and I'll have to double check. That is the information that we have, but I'm not sure if it has been published and made available to the public yet. So if so, yes, I will email it to you. If not, that information will be a part of our CPC presentation. And once it is made available to the public, available on our city web pages. The presentation for that information, if you're interested in getting more info about Board of Zoning Adjustments, you can come to our Board of Zoning Adjustment hearing, not the next one, but the following hearing. You'll be able to hear about those more in depth, what we were able to gather on BZA cases. Again, thank you. Have a wonderful evening and good night.
Thank you.